Hi everyone, it's Chris and welcome back to another video. Thank you for joining me today. Now, ever since the world became aware of something called punk, there's been this conversation about its birthplace. Some say that it began in England with the Pistols and the Clash, the Damned and so on. Some people say it's New York City. But if you consider the MC5 or the Stooges as history's first punk band, could it be Detroit? And if you think it's Detroit, then you're probably forgetting about a band called the Velvet Underground, a New York band. So even before the Stooges, the Velvets were putting Lou Reed's kind of very nasty adult originals about drugs, so Heroin and Waiting for the Man, songs about gender and sexuality like Candy Says, and all of those things really in songs like Sister Ray. And they were putting that content to kind of vicious, primitive, feedback-drenched rock and roll. And they look different as well, so dressed in black leather, wraparound shades. When the rest of the world wanted to go to San Francisco and take LSD and have flowers in their hair, this lot were the kind of counterculture's alternative. So I think what they did successfully as a band is they recreated rock and roll for the East Coast kind of urban environment in which they lived, and I think they became the signature sound of New York's underground music scene, which means for me the story of punk really begins with the Velvet Underground in the 1960s in New York. So the origin and the cultural hub of the punk scene began, I think, in New York City with a few pioneering bands. Now, was it a better scene than maybe the London scene? So the New York scene was started by bands like New York Dolls via the Mercer Arts Center, and then when that shut down, onto CBGB's and Max's Kansas City, and those places took on loads of new bands. And then there was the London scene with the Roxy, the Marquee, Speakeasy, and so on, and that was kick-started really by bands like, I know, Eddie and the Hot Rods, and then cemented by the Pistols, the Clash, the Damned, and so on. But was one scene better than the other? I don't know. For me, there was an age thing that was the difference between New York bands and the UK bands. So the New York bands tended to be mid to late 20s, whereas the UK bands tended to be teen sort of bands. And I think what makes it both fascinating and relevant are their respective styles. So the New York scene was very much more eclectic than the London scene. The London scene was very uniform in its sound, and I think there's an argument that says that London bands pretty much all sounded the same. Now, British punks, I think they popularised and defined the genre, but as Richard Hell said, we were much more interesting here in New York. So here in Britain, I think punk started with very much the kind of youthful, reductive, no frills approach to music. And there were some absolutely amazing, groundbreaking bands. But I think what's more interesting about British punk is the glorious period that followed the breakup of the Sex Pistols, the post-punk kind of era where we had Peel Magazine, Joy Division, Susie, Killing Joke, etc. Whereas the New York scene, I think, started very eclectic in the first place. So for me, there's no better scene. There are bands that I like from both, but both made, I think, really important, valid and distinct contributions. But I think New York City may well have started it off in the first place. So the origins of punk for me were in New York, and punk to me has always been an American term. It always takes me back to Dirty Harry, for example, which is probably the first time I ever heard that phrase. So here are some of New York City's finest contributions to the genre of punk, many who helped create and inform that genre. And the first up, I don't actually have an album by them, it's New York Dolls, and they turned being a kind of a misfit into something absolutely fabulous, didn't they? They were wearing women's clothes mixed with kind of leather, they had lipstick, their hair was, bouffant and looked after, outrageously teased, they wore powder on their faces, and New York Dolls blasted out like a Bronx version of the Rolling Stones through a wall of amps. Now, their first two albums, which I'm still on the hunt for at a decent price, became, I think, the worldwide primer to the first punk generation, alongside stuff like Raw Power by the Stooges. They kind of embodied for me the New York street rock better than any other band, maybe other than the Velvet Underground themselves. And the first time I heard them was on this Vertigo sampler, which was a lot of Sire artists actually, and a lot of those New York bands, and the song Personality Crisis, which is the song that kicks off their debut, is one of my favourite by them. Okay, next up is television. So Tom Miller and Lester Myers were, I think, boarding school friends who ran away to New York to become poets. They saw the dolls at the Mercer Art Centre and everything changed. They changed their names to Tom Verlaine and Richard Hell. They cut their hair, they cut their clothes and formed a band called the Neon Boys, which then morphed into a band called Television. They convinced a bar owner in the Bowery area, whose name was Hilly Crystal, who eventually founded CBGB's, to let them play. And they soon began playing at the CBGB's every Sunday. In fact, they started in 2 nights a week and then they went to 4 nights a week. And just like the Beatles did in the Hamburg days, they developed their sound into something unlike anything else around, a kind of a dual guitar driven soundscape of fairly kind of free-spirited jazz influenced harmonics, which was fueled by this kind of rivalry between 2 lead guitarists. And they played the CBGB's so often that they unofficially became the house band. And they did, they had an amazing debut album and a song for which they're very well known. Now, no longer seeing room for himself in this band, Richard Hell left the band in about 75 for other adventures. And initially, whilst they were playing kind of a raw garagey rock, almost a punk template, eventually Tom Verlaine would guide the band into a sort of like a modernist kind of jam band, which was built around that lead guitar interplay between him and a guy called Richard Lloyd, and that comes to the fore on the classic track Marquy Moon, which comes from their classic album, the angular, studious, classic 77 debut Marquy Moon by Television. This arguably kick-started what we now refer to, I think, as post-punk. They were sharply dressed, they were effortlessly cool, they were hugely influential, and very, very few bands blended that kind of almost avant-garde jazz with 1960s rock in such a digestible kind of way as this band did. And the title track, Marquy Moon, from the debut, just remains, from me anyway, a real touchstone of post-punk. It's nearly 10 minutes long, and sometimes I wish it would last even longer than that. It's a tremendous song. Next up, we've got Patti Smith. This is a New York street poet. She started life really. She began sharing her kind of mystical, her profane verses atop Lenny Kaye's electrical guitar improvisations in this kind of early 70s. And by the time CBGB's was kind of in full flight as early punk's kind of spiritual home, Lenny Kaye became part of a full band that backed the band for Patti Smith. And as soon as on this album, she asserted Jesus died for somebody's sins but not mine, on a dramatic and just jaw-droppingly brilliant rendition of them's Gloria, together with a poem that she wrote in the early 70s called The Oath. She just threw down the gauntlet to everyone. She said that, hey, punk isn't about 3 chords, teenage angst and rebel music. It can be poetic. And she was like a cool punk poet laureate, effortlessly fusing kind of poetic language of songwriters like Bob Dylan with the kind of snarl and edge of punk. And this, her 1975 debut, Horses, I think is a New York punk classic. I love Land, Gloria, just amazing. What a way to start the album. And Redondo Beach, which kind of effortlessly mixes kind of the chill out vibe of reggae with a kind of a punk edge. So fantastic album. Next up is the Dictators, and this is a band that's often credited with being the first true punk band to emerge out of New York, creating, if you like, punk music way before it actually had a name and had an identity. This isn't their debut album, this is their 3rd album, which is great. It's a track on here called Stay With Me, which is just absolutely brilliant. And this is a band with some good songwriting, some really kind of quite heavy guitar, pile-driving guitar, and they were a more intelligent, more dynamic distillation of power chords and humour and New York culture. Their first album, this album is on Asylum Records, but I think their first album was possibly on Epic, came out in 75, and it features a really creative, a radically creative cover of Sonny and Cher's I Got You Babe, as well as their version of California Sun, which the Ramones later did. Talking of which, the debut album from the Ramones, a shot taken in the Bowery area, I think, of New York. The opening track, Blitzkrieg Bop, was the "You Can Do This Too" clarion call to the world. They were simple, they were melodic, and what they did is they essentially took the lessons from the Dolls and the Dictators and just made it more accessible. And for me, punk has always been about infusing simplicity with a kind of a personality, and they did this so well. Punk simply would not have existed if it hadn't been for this little band from Forest Hill, Hill in Queens. Just a brilliant band. Johnny Ramone, Joey Ramone, Dee Dee Ramone, Tommy Ramone. Yes, they weren't related, but yeah, fantastic band. Apparently, Johnny Ramone said they didn't sing about cars and girls because they couldn't afford a car and they didn't have any girlfriends, but they just sung about what they saw all around them. Just such an influential band. And that album is produced by Craig Leon, who produced the first album for Blondie as well. And this band, they started as a not terribly competent revitalisation of kind of 60s pop and girl group sounds. Songs like Kung Fu Girls, The Attack of the Giant Ants, for example. But they had two real secret weapons. One was the recently sadly departed Clem Burke, who was like the Keith Moon of the Lower East Side, just a brilliant drummer, and of course Debbie Harry, who had this great voice but also this kind of Marilyn Monroe kind of charisma. And so Craig Leon produced this and actually squeezed out some pretty decent stuff on here. For example, Ex Offender, which has got their keyboard player Jimmy Destry playing some really nice organ over the top of it. It sounds a bit like kind of 96 Tears like organ. But later on their third album, along came Mike Chapman of Chin and Chapman fame, and he tightened them further for this, which is their masterpiece album, even coaxing a bit of mock disco out of them with Heart of Glass. This is a fantastic album, and I think they became punk's first worldwide successful band. What Debbie Harry did, I think, is she brought 60s pop sensibility to New York punk scene, and also, smashed through that glass ceiling where it was a bit of a boys' club at times. And then we've got the Heartbreakers. So the New York Dolls guitarist Johnny Thunders and their drummer Jerry Nolan, I think we're getting quite tired of David Johansen, and they contacted television's recently departed bassist Richard Hell, and they're asking him just to bring his kind of edgy, poetic songwriting, his stage presence, his quirky vocals, his bass playing to their band. And shortly after, they added Walter Lure as a guitarist. But after about a year, I think Richard Hell did leave the band, making way for a guy called Billy Ruth, but he did leave behind Chinese Rocks, which is co-written with Dee Dee Ramone and it's all obviously about opiate addiction. And then in about 1976 they went to the UK, where I think they pretty much stayed, and they opened on the Sex Pistols Anarchy tour and managed to get a record deal which they'd been denied in the States, and this is on Track Records. And their debut album LAMF is just fantastic, and in One Track Mind they do have one of the best songs of the entire era for me. And then we got Richard Hell. Richard Hell invented the punk look, I think. That's just so punky, isn't it? It's fantastic. But he had little to show for that kind of pioneering look, and he was getting tired of the kind of primitive garage rock that many had become. So he created Richard Hell and the Voidoids, and in doing so created some of the most powerful and atypical music ever to be dubbed punk. And this was the album, I think, where he did that, Blank Generation. It's an absolute attitude-soaked punk classic for me, especially the title track, which is a reworking of the 1959 song called Beat Generation by a guy called Rod McEwen. He was the person that wrote Seasons in the Sun that was made famous by Terry Jacks. But a great version of that and a great album. Really good album. Next up, we've got Talking Heads. Now, I think this band changed music, not just punk. They showed New York that punk could be fun, it could be worldly, it could be groovy. And they blended a kind of a more of a post-punk sound, I think, with some African percussion influences and even a little bit of disco, and produced music that was much more cerebral in its approach, bringing in a bit of funk on Fear of Music and Remain in Light, those two albums. So, and to be honest, has anyone ever written a more iconic bass line than Tina Weymouth on Psycho Killer? What an absolutely brilliant song that is. And the last band, actually, I don't think are from New York. They're from Cleveland, Ohio, but they are kind of an export to New York, so I'm going to include them. And it's the Dead Boys. This is their debut, Young, Loud and Snotty. Now, Joey Ramone suggested to their vocalist Steve Bators that they auditioned for the CBGB's owner, Hilly Crystal, and they impressed him with their kind of raw Stooges sound, and they produced on this album, I think, one of the classics of New York punk, but just punk generally, and that's Sonic Reducer. It's brilliant, and New York pretty quickly loved the kind of Iggy style antics and the Alice Cooper like vocals, and this debut, Young, Loud and Snotty, remains one of US punk's classic albums, I think, especially that debut, that opening track. So I think New York, although It can't lay claim to being the only place where punk came from. Of course, UK was massive for punk. I do think that it was started in New York in the very early 70s. And these bands were hugely influential on many of the UK ones. Tell me what you think anyway in the comments below, and I'm sure I'll be back sometime with another video. Cheers.